In this, our 24th lecture, we continue our exploration of the life lessons that we can learn from great books. And in this particular section, we are discussing adventure. Life is an adventure. And in last lecture, we looked at the life of a man blessed to find his destiny and to carry out one of the most magnificent adventures in all of American history, Meriwether Lewis. We turn now to another man who found his destiny, Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. And the great book he wrote is his 7 Pillars of Wisdom. T.E. Lawrence, a man who for much of his generation seemed shrouded in mystery. He was born in August of 1888. His father was a kind of minor league English aristocrat whose family had settled in Ireland. His father was Thomas Chapman. He was the 7th Baronet of Westmeath. However, he had created quite a scandal. Lawrence's father had. He had run away from his wife and family with the children's nanny and had started a family with the nanny, Sarah. And it was into this illicit family that Lawrence was born as one of 5 sons, Thomas Edward. And he could have been called Chapman, but at this stage of his life, his family, his mother and his father, were living under an assumed name in Oxford. And the assumed name was Lawrence. So this is how he came to be called. T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Edward, his brothers always called him Ned. But his real friends in later life called him just T.E. The name Lawrence meant nothing to him, and he would change it on more than one occasion. He was a bright boy, hated school. School, he later said, was the biggest waste of time I ever had. Just like Winston Churchill, just like the great Gandhi, these other towering figures of the 20th century, school was just a waste of time. Churchill called it a cave into which I was forced to enter, from which I finally stumbled out, learning nothing. All the regulations of school, all the pedestrian teachers who want to pound their knowledge into you. Lawrence was very gifted in languages. Picked up French when his family traveled there in France, but he'd come back to school and they would demand that he follow the rules of the grammar. Well, why do I have to decline this or conjugate this? Because it's in the grammar book, but I already know how to speak it. So he didn't do very well at school, but he got into Oxford, studied there, and once again cut a very unconventional figure. Life at Oxford still revolves around in good part, your college, the college to which you belong, and you go to have dinner in the dining hall, the professors sitting up on the high table. Lawrence lived at home, didn't live in college, lived there at Oxford. His mother gave him his own room, and her only regulation was that he be home by 12 every night. But then he could go back out again. That didn't bother her. So every night he'd come back at 12 and then roam around Oxford. And he liked to stay up all night long, reading these medieval romances that we've been talking about. Tristan and Isolde, Percival, the La Morte d'Arthur, the story of Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot. These were his real nourishment. He read for a degree in history and was doing well enough so that his tutor said, you could do an honors degree, but you need a thesis. Why don't you go to the library and write a thesis? That wasn't for Lawrence. He set out for Syria. I want to write a thesis on the Crusades, and in particular, I'm interested in architecture, and I want to study the Crusader castles from the Middle Ages. Remember our first crusade that we talked about? How in 1095, Pope Urban preached the crusade. The Crusaders went out, liberated the city of Jerusalem, and stayed on for generations, building castles in the Latin kingdoms that they created in the Holy Land. I want to go out and study these Crusader castles in Syria and see if the pointed arch, Gothic architecture, actually went from the west to the Crusader lands or from the Crusader lands to the west. So out he went. Do you know any Arabic? No, not a word. But he went to a local minister who had been a missionary in Syria, learned a little bit of Arabic, and then began to wander around, looking at these Crusader castles, and went to one of the British archaeological excavations that was going on in the in Syria there, and introduced himself to the archaeologist, a very distinguished man, D.G. Hogarth. And Hogarth was much taken with Oxford and much taken with Lawrence, and offered to be one of his mentors and readers of his dissertation on Crusader castles in Syria, and invited him to join his excavation in 1910 there in Syria at the site of Carchemish, which was a Hittite archaeological site. And Lawrence picked up some more Arabic, but he also learned that Hogarth, like almost every British archaeologist working there in the Middle East, was also a spy, an intelligence agent. And they reported regularly on the political goings-on inside the Ottoman Empire, of which Syria was part, the Turkish Empire. Already the Middle East had become profoundly important to the British. First of all, it was their key to India. And in those days before World War I, India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a vast empire in itself, and the British king was Emperor of India. And the only way to India easily was through the Suez Canal. And the Ottoman Empire, controlling Arabia as it did, these Turks were always a threat to the Suez Canal. Secondly, the British Navy had been converted to petroleum, to diesel, in order to be more heavily armored. This had been the work of Winston Churchill. And petroleum was now vital. And the Middle East was where so much petroleum already came from. So the archaeologist carefully listened to the political goings-on inside the Ottoman Empire, and one of Lawrence's jobs was to make an archaeological survey, which in fact meant mapping various strategic areas that might be of importance to British troops at some moment if a war should come. So this is what he was doing in 1914 when the Great War broke out in Europe. And early on, the Ottoman Empire, a decaying empire with a great deal of internal unrest, a very oppressive government, and Lawrence leaves a brutal account of the oppressive quality of Turkish rule in the Arabian Peninsula and in areas like Syria. The Ottoman Empire cast its lot with Germany and entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Even the Sultan proclaimed a holy war against the infidels. And the Turkish armies began to menace the Suez Canal. And the capture of the Suez Canal was the one event that could have forced the British government to make a negotiated peace. And to stall that, the British launched their great expedition that we mentioned in an earlier lecture against Gallipoli in the Dardanelles to prevent the Turks from massing all their forces along the Suez Canal. But that ended in miserable failure. 250,000 British troops lost in that 1915 campaign. So by 1916, the British government was desperate for some success in the Middle East and some means of preventing the Turks from capturing the Suez Canal. Lawrence, in the meanwhile, had been enlisted in the army and had gone out to serve in Cairo in the intelligence branch. He had originally been sent out as a civilian, but the generals were absolutely furious when the civilian got up and tried to lecture to them. So he had to be made a lieutenant, and there he was. And he had a little office, and he would carefully work on all these reports and do his job as well as he could. But he got his Arabic to be ever more fluent, just walking the streets of Cairo. He never believed in classroom lectures. He believed in just meeting ordinary people. And he began to develop a real rapport with ordinary Arabs, speaking their language, understanding their ways, not acting as a haughty Englishman, but just like an Arab. Then in December of 1916, the British decided to make use of his talents. In June of that year, 1916, there had arisen a revolt in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein, a direct descendant of the Prophet, had decided to break with the Ottoman Empire and to proclaim the independence of the Arab tribes and to lead them in a revolt against the Ottomans. And Lawrence was dispatched as part of a small group to go out and judge how effective this revolt in the desert, as it came to be called, actually was, and whether it could serve any useful purpose for the British to send troops to aid the Arabs and the Sharif Hussein of Mecca in this revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Lawrence met Hussein, and he met his son Faisal, And in Faisal he found a kindred spirit, a man who breathed the fires of Arab nationalism, who dreamt of a day when the whole Arab world might be united under the faith of Islam and speaking the Arabic language, who was a warrior and a diplomat. And Lawrence believed that Faisal, not the father, but Faisal, could bring success to this Arab revolt. And he pledged to Faisal that he would go back to Cairo and explain to the British High Command that they should sponsor the revolt, but not send troops. British troops under British officers would absolutely fail out there in the desert. It had to be an irregular force of Arabs. And so Lawrence went back to Cairo and said, "Don't send men, send one man. I will go back." Now here's a lieutenant telling the High Command that he's going to go back and be in charge of this revolt. Well, they pondered it a bit, and the commander-in-chief said, well, he goes out there, he fails. We can say we took his best advice, and that'll be that. Because the Arab revolt is never going to amount to anything. The real war is being fought in France. And the real war will be won by killing Germans in France. That's where I want to be transferred to. But let him go out there, because this Arab revolt in the desert is the sideshow of a sideshow. And in fact, the whole Middle Eastern campaign is just a sideshow. So let him go. And so Lawrence went out. And almost immediately he began to win over not just Faisal, but many of the tribal leaders. His Arabic was still very halting, and one of the things of Arabic is that it has a number of different branches. They're not even dialects, they're quite different languages in a way, deriving all from classical Arabic. And he had spoke the dialect of Syria, and he spoke a little bit of Egyptian Arabic, but they spoke the pure Arabic of the peninsula. So he would listen to them. They would talk to him. He learned how to ride a camel very, very well, and he began to draw up a list of how to deal with Arabs. First of all, you distinguish very carefully, he said, between the Arabs of the towns and the Bedouin, the nomads of the desert, the proud and resolute warriors. They look upon the Arabs of the town as shifty and treacherous, and they alone are like medieval knights. And Lawrence began to see himself something like a crusader, but with the same sympathy for the Arabs that a Richard the Lionheart had held. You must always respect their leader, always strengthen him, never detract from him in public, never lecture to him, avoid formal meetings with Faisal or Hussein. Instead, be their constant guest and just drop suggestions in their ear, and always convince them that the suggestions you are making are really their own ideas. Dress as an Arab does. As long as you dress like an Englishman, you may be more comfortable, but you will always be the foreigner. And every guest who comes to see Faisal will look upon you as a foreign officer there. So he adopted the garb of the Arabs and came to rejoice in it. Speak their language, keep learning from them. Never disparage your own religion, he said. Avoid talking about religion as much as you can, but when you're asked a question, see that you know and show that you know the religion of Islam very well and deeply respect it. Never wear a hat or a cap. It is a sign of evil to them. Yes, never put on a hat or a cap. Learn the tribes. Learn how to distinguish a Hawitat from a Beni Hassan by his dress, by the very language that he uses. And avoid any deep discussions until you have completely mastered the language, because otherwise you'll get into a lot of difficulty. Now, all of this advice on how to learn the ways of the Middle East might be useful to certain diplomats today in various countries trying to understand the Middle East. So he became accepted, and the High Command looked upon this one man who had been sent out as, well, just a kind of little charade. But Lawrence saw that the Arab revolt could become the key to distracting the Turks and to enabling the British to win the kind of major victory that was so desperately needed to keep the ordinary British voter invested in this war, because things were going very badly on the Western Front. 1916 was the year of Verdun and the terrible slaughter. 1916 was the year of the Battle of the Somme, when 60,000 British soldiers were killed in one day of July there in France. And the British public, like the German public, like the French public, was deeply disgusted and tired of this war. And the distractions of the Arab revolt might be the key. The first step was to win the confidence of the Arab troops. And Lawrence developed them into a fast-striking camel corps. They learned very rapidly, and he learned that they could not charge fortifications like the city of Medina, where there was a strong Turkish garrison with heavy artillery pieces. So instead, he decided to be like a pirate and to use the Arabs that he was leading and the great desert like a sea, and to strike wherever the Turks thought he would not be. And that was striking along the railroad. That railroad running from Damascus all the way down to Medina, the Hejaz Railroad it was called. That was the lifeline of the Turkish garrison. All supplies had to go down it. If they were going to ever make an assault upon the Suez Canal, the supplies would have to come down the Hejaz Railroad. So he began to blow up parts of it, parts of it, parts of it. And the Turks put a huge ransom on his head, and he started being called Prince Dynamite, as he would lead these small striking forces, blow up a portion of the railroad, never blowing it all up because that might make the Turks abandon it, but just blowing enough parts so that they would have to spend day after day repairing it. Then he led his forces in a striking assault, always going along with the Arab chieftains and making it seem that it was their idea, and moved their base of supplies from Yimbo further up the Red Sea. And then he convinced them in the burning hot summer of 1917 to strike across and capture Aqaba, the port deep up in the Red Sea. That would be a close link to Damascus. And there he crossed, starting off with just a band of 50 warriors. They began to cross the great Nefu Desert. One of his chieftains was Auda Abu Tai of the Hawitat tribe. 50 years of age, Lawrence describes him. His hair streaked with silver, but a powerful man, his beard clipped closely in the Hawitat fashion. He had killed 75 Arabs with his bare hands. And when I asked him about the number of Turks he had killed, he said, "I don't know, I don't even count them." And so they began riding across the great Nefu Desert. Can 50 men capture the garrison city of Aqaba with its heavy guns? Abu Adatai said, "We will find my brethren, the Hawitat, and they're coming into their pasture land for the year, and they will join us, and we will ride against Aqaba, if you can assure us that the Turks will not blow us up with their big guns." And Lawrence said, he's a genius at guerrilla warfare, "Their guns are all trained out to sea. They think the British fleet will attack them. They will never believe that we can cross the great desert." And so, riding hard and fast, they began to cross the Nefu. As they were riding along one evening, almost out of water, desperate to get to the next watering hole, Lawrence noticed that one of their riders, who had been with them from the beginning, Qasim, was no longer there. And the other chieftain said, "Qasim must have fallen asleep and fell off of his camel. He's gone. There's no way we can go back and get him. If we go back, we'll run out of water and the camels will start dying. It is all they can do to make the next miles to the next watering hole." Lawrence said, "I will go back." And Chief Ali, the Sharif, was absolutely furious. "You are going against the will of God. It is written that Qasim will die in the desert. You are a blasphemer. You're an Englishman. You'll never understand us." And Lawrence said, "I will go back." And he rode back through that night. And as the sun was already up, he found Qasim wandering. Put him onto the saddle and rode back. And as they came out of the burning sun, Ali said, "Truly, for some men, nothing is written." And from this moment on, they began to dress him in the robes of a war chief of the Arabs. And they rode on to Aqaba. And just as Lawrence had predicted, the Turkish guns were turned out to the sea. And they captured the great city of Aqaba. War is cruelty. The Turks were savage in their warfare and the atrocities that they carried out. So too were the Arabs. And much of the garrison was put to the sword. The town was sacked. And Abu al-Attai kept looking for the gold that he was told was in Aqaba, and found only these chests with huge amounts of paper money in them, which he threw up in the air and threw away. What good is paper? I want the gold you promised, Lawrence. And Lawrence said, we need to send a telegraph to the British so they will send supplies to us here at Aqaba and let them know we have captured the city. But the telegraph was destroyed by the Arabs in their fury. They saw this little machine there and beat it. So how are we going to get word? I will cross the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal. And once again, Ali, the Sharif, and Abu al-Attai, the chief of the Hawattat, said, no man can cross the Sinai. And Lawrence said, truly, Moses did. But Moses was sent by God. And with only 8 riders, in fact, he set out across the Sinai. His camels walking, if they rode the whole way at top speed, which they needed because there was only one watering hole along the way, the camels would wear out. But if you've ever ridden a camel, you know how terrible they sway, they make you seasick. So it was very tiring on them, but the camels at least got through. But he reached the Suez Canal, and the British garrison that had been there had gone across the canal to the Egyptian side. There were no boats or anything, but he walked into what had been the British camp, and there was a telephone on the wall. He said, well, maybe it works. And sure enough, I guess they had paid their fees for that month. And he rang up and got the operator. And the operator said, who is this? It's Lieutenant Lawrence. I'm sorry you're not on my list. I need to get a boat across the Suez Canal to report to the High Command that we have captured the city of Aqaba. I'm sorry, that doesn't fall under my authority. You'll need to talk with the Water Transportation Board, the Army Water Transportation Board. I need a boat. Click. Call back. Can you give me the number of the Water Transportation Board? Of course. I'll give it to him. Calls the Water Transportation Board. Water Transportation Board operator says, I'm sorry, we don't have any authorization to send out boats for Lieutenant Lawrence. You have got to let me have it. I'm sorry, sir, you're being very rude. Hang up. Rings back. It's a different operator. He says, it's no bloody good talking to those operators. I will contact my superior. And the superior calls back to Lawrence and says, I'm going to send a boat. Just don't tell anybody I did it. And so he gets across, catches the train, still dressed in Arab garb, absolutely filthy. But when he arrives at the High Command, the porters don't want to even let him in the door. He's an Arab. But he blusters his way in and then sees an old friend who tells him there's been a change in command. Sir Edmund Allenby is now general. And Allenby immediately takes a deep liking and admiration for this Lawrence. And Lawrence lays out to him what he's already achieved. And Allenby, who had lost his reputation in France, has come out to the Middle East to regain it. And he tells Lawrence, I will give you everything you need. I will give you all the money you need. You must distract the Turks while I march up and capture Jerusalem. And so Lawrence goes back. He's exhausted. But he takes his now hardened veteran army, swollen by more members as a result of the success at Aqaba, and holds down the flank while Allenby marches towards Jerusalem. Blowing up the railroad, Lawrence does. At one point, going into an Arab town, Deraa, to find out more information about where the Turkish forces are, being taken captive, brutally beaten, but refusing to admit that he is anything more than a Circassian in the mountainous region of the Caucasus, hence his blonde hair and blue eyes. So he's let go. And he comes back, and his irregular cavalry and camels hold down the flank. And finally a plane is sent to him, and Allenby says, I want you there with me when I walk into Jerusalem. Shortly before Christmas, 1917. And the Crusaders have come back and retaken the holy city from the Turks. And Lawrence walks in with Allenby, then back for the final assault upon Damascus. And once again, the camel corps of Lawrence of Arabia rides on the far flank, convincing the Turks that the main assault is going to come from that far flank, while Allenby moves up the seashore on his pursuit of Damascus. And now Lawrence has a bodyguard. Some people called them cutthroats, he said, but they didn't cut anybody's throat. I didn't tell them to. I needed hard riders, hard livers, hard fighters, men with no families, like Ali of Aleppo. And in September, the city of Damascus fell. And Lawrence, now riding in his armored car, the Blue Mist, leads his forces into Damascus. And even the ladies of the harem open up the windows and pour flowers down upon the heads of this liberating force. And he has achieved his mission. Now, in the course of this revolt, the British government has promised the Arabs that they will have an independent nation. And in fact, a declaration has been sent out on November the 7th, 1918, that an independent Arab state will be supported by the British and French governments. And Lawrence has made this promise. In the back of his mind, he's always worried about it and worried that he would be played false by the diplomats. And true enough, as the Paris Peace Conference begins to dawn in 1919, the British and the French begin to backtrack on their promise. The Middle East is too vital. The British want to control Iraq, Jordan, as well as Egypt. The French want to control Syria. Lawrence goes to the conference as the spokesperson for Faisal. But the Arab state seems to be denied. And Lawrence, in disgust, goes back home. Everyone clamors for him to stay in the army. He's been promoted a colonel. He's been awarded all kinds of decorations. But he resigns his commission. He will have nothing to do with these false politicians. But there's one politician he trusts, Winston Churchill. And Churchill asked him in 1921 to come into his government as an advisor. And he asked Lawrence straight out, what should we do with the Middle East? And Lawrence said, you must have an independent state in Iraq. And so Iraq is created and Faisal is made its king. And Abdullah, another son of Hussein, he should be king of Transjordan. And still today there sits upon the throne of Jordan King Abdullah. In Iraq and Jordan, they were Lawrence's settlement for the Middle East that Winston Churchill put into place. He's the one politician you can trust, the one statesman. And Churchill said, with me behind him, Lawrence can be anything he wants. But all Lawrence wanted was anonymity. He had had his moment of destiny, and he knew how false the world was. People kept hounding him to bring out his book about the revolt in the desert, and writing that almost broke his mental health, just putting down in pages all that suffering that he had to go through. Finally, he asked, can I just go back into the army? Can I join the Royal Air Force? Well, sure, you want to be a general? No, I want to join as a private. Well, it's the craziest thing we've ever heard of. You can't, you're a colonel. I want to be a private. And finally, using connections like Winston Churchill, he was allowed to enlist as simply Airman Ross. But the media would never leave him alone. It kept hounding him, and everywhere he went, they followed him with their snapshots and stories about Lawrence this, Lawrence that, and what he was really up to. So he was forced out of the Air Force. Finished his book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, taken from Proverbs. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn it out of 7 pillars. And then asked, can I please go into something like the Tank Corps? Yes. But once again, the press followed him. He was finally allowed back into the Royal Air Force in 1925, again, just a private. Just wanting anonymity, he was sent out to what we would call Pakistan today. And once again, this time the American media got news of it. And they began to publish stories that Colonel Lawrence, General Lawrence, they said, is a spy out in India working against the interests of the Soviet Union. And finally, he came back to England, stayed on in the Royal Air Force, though, and found a certain degree of anonymity, escaping every weekend to his little cottage, Clouds Hill, writing and publishing on his own a translation of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is all about traveling and killing. I've done a lot of both, he said. His enlistment ran out in the spring of 1935, and following his favorite thing to do, he was riding his motorbike. May the 13th, 1935. and he swerved to avoid two little boys on their bicycle, crashed, and died a few days later. He didn't want to be buried in Westminster. Well, that's what the public wanted. They put a bust of him there, but he was buried in a small family plot, and among those who stood around his grave were Winston and Clementine Churchill.